My name's Martin Clarke, and I'm Head of Music at the Open University. And it's my pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists, Dr. Rommi Smith, award-winning writer and poet, who is the librettist for Forever, having worked very closely with the composer Roderick Williams in the creation of this new work that we're looking forward to hearing, and Professor Donald Burrows, Emeritus Professor of Music at the Open University. Each of us is going to share some thoughts, Rommi on the creation of this work, Donald and I more broadly on music and commemoration. There'll be some time for questions and discussion at the end, so please do think of any questions you might have as we go along. Well, we're going to begin with a recording from Roderick Williams, who can't be here this evening, but he wanted to share some thoughts as part of this on the process of creating the music for this new work. So we're going to start with that video.
I think the interesting thing for me is responding to this commission as a musician, because I'm attracted to Amazing Grace primarily through the melody. I'm sure that's how a lot of musicians access this. It's such an iconic melody that the whole point of the brief was to commemorate the words and not the melody, which is attached to it much later. So the melody is incredibly strong, incredibly powerful, the shape of it, because I guess of its folk nature. So I knew that to refer to that would be to almost obliterate everything else. But not to refer to it would also leave a great question mark. So I had a feeling that I needed to deal with that at the outset of the piece, and that's what I did in the overture. And the first movement is to refer to the melody and then leave that alone, so that we can concentrate then wholly on the words. And for the words, obviously this is not my department, I'm a musician, so I knew that I needed help here in order to tell whatever story we wanted to tell. We didn't want to tell a story about John Newton specifically. We wanted to tell a story about how people have responded to what he wrote ever since then. I knew I needed help. I knew I needed someone like Rommi Smith, and she came straight to my mind because I've been collaborating with her in the past, one or two very particular things, and she has an extraordinary way of getting to the heart of things. She's also a wonderful and a hugely patient listener. So she was just the person to come to Olney, to come to Milton Keynes, and to listen to testimonies from all sorts of different people who have different reactions to the words of Amazing Grace. I was absolutely delighted when she accepted, for one thing. When she came here and did her research, she spent a great deal of time with people, listening to their stories, listening to their points of view. And from that, she produced a number of songs. We whittled it down, I'm sure, to 10. I'm sure there could have been an infinite number. 10 reactions to Amazing Grace. And they are wonderfully varied. And this, of course, it gives me, in my musical response, a chance to be varied in the kind of musical setting. And I hope I've used that opportunity to tell Rommi's stories, to tell the stories of the people that Rommi has approached in some sort of musical form as well. Rommi's poetry comes in a variety of poetic forms, and this is very inspirational for me as a musician, again, to find patterns that will mirror her writing in some way. This, I'm sure for both of us, is partly an intellectual response to the blank page. Form and structure helps us both. But also it's a way of turning something that is a true personal testimony into, you remove it by one space by turning it into something that is deliberately artistic, as it were, poetic, and then from my point of view, musical. And another key point for me is the performers, Chineke, the instrumental ensemble who are going to be performing, and also the choir that have been assembled specifically for this occasion, who I know come from gospel choirs around Milton Keynes and further afield. So I knew I was writing for a community choir with gospel influences, and therefore I felt that writing them something that has no gospel sound in it at all would be a little bit strange. So I write in a variety of styles, I sing in a variety of styles. So for me, writing gospel-inspired music for them seemed like a natural thing. So of course, across the 10 movements, with 2 solo voices, mezzo-soprano and tenor, and with the choir, we explore the voices that Rommi has chosen, and we do that in a variety of ways. And I think we stir around the contemporary reactions to the words that came out 250 years ago. That was really one of the things, again, that was so crucial to me about asking Rommi to take part, because without words, I have no story to write. Other than being asked for an abstract piece with no words at all, just an orchestral overture or something like that. But as soon as you have words, then you have the chance to tell a story or make a point. And I really needed a collaborator. That's why I really needed Rommi to be part of that. It was interesting to me then that in terms of a contested narrative, it was interesting that she chose a range of opinions about Amazing Grace, and not just opinions that were positive towards it. So I found it very interesting to set words that have question marks all over them, including, of course, incidentally, the title of the piece, which I thought was a masterstroke by Rommi. The 5th song, for example, is a tenor solo in which he doesn't sing, actually, he speaks. And the song is called Glorious Things, question marks. So glorious things of thee are spoken. And the singer speaks across music which is quite disrespectful, actually. I've intentionally written disrespectful music. It's reminiscent a little bit of Peter Maxwell Davies's 8 Songs for a Mad King, which are also in their way disrespectful. They take something, King George, and they take his sound world, and then Peter Maxwell Davies plays 20th century games, almost blows raspberries at it. And this gave me a chance to do something similar here, and just make sure that people can hear all sides. I'd like to say both sides, but actually I mean all sides of an argument. Similarly, in the 8th song, I have 2 choirs, one who are singing. They're both aspects of a Sierra Leonean response to this, to the text of Amazing Grace, and one takes a great deal of solace from it, and the other very much the opposite. And I have the 2 choirs sing this first, the positive side, which is of course in a major key, and then the negative side, which is in a minor key. It's a very old compositional trick. But then I put the 2 of them together, and they sing in and amongst each other in the same key, with trying to maintain their integrity musically across a unified accompaniment. And I was intrigued to see how far I could make this work. That'll be for the audience to decide whether it's been successful. And it also happens that the 2 melodies I've given these 2 voices are mirror images of each other. And this is borrowing something from Rommi's poetic structure. So all of this is going on. I hope the audience are not aware of that. They need not be aware of that at all, but they can be aware that the voices are in opposition, and then they're overlaid so that they dovetail to make a third song. And this is again a Rommi structure: 2 separate poems, which when they are put on top of each other, create a third poem, and that's what I was trying to achieve musically. So it's through devices like that, often prompted by Rommi's text, that I'm able to process all these aspects of the response to Amazing Grace.
I'm going to hand now to Rommi. We've heard a lot already from Roderick about the importance of the partnership. So over to you, Rommi, for your perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to everybody for coming here this evening, both to this talk and also to see the piece. Can I check that you can hear me okay? Because normally I would stand, but because of the recording, I am sat. I usually like to use my hand a lot too, but we'll see how this goes. So, first of all, in thinking about the role of new music and poetry in marking key events and dates, it seems fitting to begin here, tonight, which is the cusp of the world premiere of the new choral work, Forever, with composition, as we have already discussed, by Roderick Williams, and text written by me. And it marks, as many of you will know, a year of AG 250, a year-long programme of talks and walks and cultural and community events curated by the Cowper and Newton Museum and its associated partners, which include the Open University and the Stables. AG 250's arts programme, as you know, marks 250 years since John Newton, then curate of Oney, wrote the sermon and accompanying hymn Amazing Grace for New Year's Day, 1773. In 2022, Roderick Williams and myself were commissioned by the Stables to create a new work in response to Amazing Grace. And the project was the initial suggestion of Tim German, who is here, who's Oney resident and classical singer himself. In an article written for The Guardian, published just a couple of days ago, Roddy gives a succinct and insightful overview of the aspects and facets of this commission. And I'd like to read it. I'm not too sure that you'll be able to see the text here at the front, so I'm just going to read what I have here. He says, "So there was my brief. Commemorate the anniversary of Amazing Grace without celebrating or glorifying its author. Acknowledge that its history is troublesome, and also without referring too closely to the melody that has contributed so much to making those words globally iconic." Okay. I turned to writer and academic Rommi Smith. She travelled from her home in Leeds to conduct hours of painstaking interviews with interested parties from the Oney area and indeed far beyond. She painstakingly assembled testimonies from individuals, all of whom had a very personal response to Amazing Grace, responses that were varied and often in opposition to each other. Rommi presented me with a series of carefully crafted poems based on her interviews. He goes on to say much what he said in the video, so I'm going to skip over this bit. But he says, "It inspired me both in forms of my emotional response and also from a musical, architectural perspective." I should say that the poems which you can see in the programme tonight are contrapuntal poems, so where there is two melody lines that are going on at the same time to give alternative perspectives, and they make this third central voice in the middle that's a combination of the both. There's also poems that borrow, like Amazing Grace, which is a ballad in form, that borrow from the ballad form, the folk form that is about storytelling. And of course, this project was about listening to people's stories. What's placed front and centre all the way through this project are the stories of the 23 people that I spoke to throughout the research journey. 23 different opinions consolidated into text that becomes the 10 pieces of poetry song for this piece called Forever ? So I want to give you a comparative. So I'm just out the other side of a PhD process, which took 7 years. And for 3 of those years, I interviewed 25 people in the UK and the US. My subject is jazz and blues music. I interviewed 23 people in 6 months for this project. So that's just to give you a kind of sense of the pace and the scale of things. And not all of those stories make their way into the words, but there are fragments. Song 10 you'll hear, and that's fragments. That's like a retrospective, an overview of what we've heard before. So I spoke with people from clergy to children, activists to actors, musicians to managers. The interviews, it's important to note, were confidential, anonymous processes, and that'll become clear when you hear some of the songs tonight. It enabled participants to talk openly and freely about their experiences of connection and, importantly, disconnection to the hymn, and it's important to flag that up. Roddy has written so generously and respectfully about the collaboration, and I'd like to say a little bit about the collaboration from my perspective as a writer. During our first in-depth conversation about the text, which I'd written by the end of January this year, he remarked that he heard music inside the words, and that he would do all he could to honour those words and the stories of the people in his composition of that text. As I finalised the writing of the text, I began receiving his Sibelius files and digital scores. And here's my poet's response to the first song poem that Roddy set, which is Song 4, and it's called Amazing. And with his permission, I'm reading it. So I write to him in early February. Hello, Roddy. Many thanks for sending your composition setting of Song 4. I'm on about my 10th listen through. It's fantastic. From the water in the very opening piano keys through to the driving energy of the bass line in solidarity with the drum line, the jazz influences of the swing in the rhythm section at 1:16, to the melody shift at 2:38, and the rising and falling of the vocal lines. It has such energy as a piece, and I can't wait to hear it with the choir, band, etc. All good wishes, and thanks, Rommi. I read that because I don't read music. I feel music, and I am at some level a frustrated musician. I am the result of a state system, unfortunately, that could not accommodate my desires to learn a musical instrument. So at the age of 9, as I was mentioning to someone earlier, when I got taken off book for a week to learn how to play John Denver's Annie song on guitar, that was it after that. There was no one else to pick me up after that. And so that meant I had nowhere to take the desire to be a musician. So words, in relative terms, were cheaper, and pen and paper was cheaper. And I knew that. So everything of my being is about working in collaboration with musicians and is about seeing words as a form of music. So there were lots of symmetries there. I've already heard music in the words, but equally, I hear words within music. And one of my favourite places actually to be is often in a rehearsal room saying nothing, just listening to musicians warm up. And I get an awful lot, I kind of see images, colours. There's a kind of sort of synesthesia there. I'll move to the next slide. So for me, this project celebrates what the first female laureate, that is Carol Ann Duffy, describes as the music of being human. And again, I'm going to read the slide because I think that it's quite small on there. Carol Ann Duffy says, "For me, poetry is the music of being human. I think it's the place where language becomes its most intense, becomes its most inventive in order to speak of our humanity, whether that's anguish or despair or memory or falling in love or going somewhere, place or history. Poetry seems to me to be the best form in the way prayer is for spiritual dialogue." And that's a quote that stayed with me throughout my writing process, that this, at some level, was about celebrating, or at a profound level, I should say, was about celebrating the music of being human. What do I mean by that? So in practical terms, in this project, there's a fusion of public and private, which are two parallel, intertwining open roads headed towards the destination that is forever. It is a project, if it celebrates anything, celebrates what Carol Ann Duffy has just said about the music of being human. Because while the final piece is and was always a public-facing work, it is inspired by 23 private, personal stories, stories of seeking and fleeing, or seeking refuge and fleeing war, stories of place and displacement, stories of connection and disconnection to the hymn and its history, which includes the writer, John Newton. Coming up to the final 2 slides now. John Berger, he writes, "If I am a storyteller, it's because I listen." I listened. Some people shared more than they came to, weeping often, weeping often during talking, sometimes surprising themselves at the unexpected road where their story had taken us. Some asked that their narratives and names were not fused through public acknowledgement, feeling a sense of fear about being exposed. Someone chose a pseudonym. Another 2 contributors asked not to be publicly acknowledged, but wanted very much to and did participate. I listened, and interviewing is a key part of my creative and critical practice. In being asked to respond to the hymn Amazing Grace, it was imperative to me to talk to other people who are experts of their own opinion. Taking a multifaceted talking heads approach to thinking about Amazing Grace means what it means to a cross-section of people in the 21st century was just one way of ensuring that this project did not fall into the seductive, common trap of telling a singular, lone protagonist, hero-focused story. Quote, "Never again shall a single story be told as if it were the only one," wrote the art critic and activist John Berger in his 1972 novel, G. Latterly, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's viral lecture entitled The Danger of a Single Story reminds us of the damage that erasure and oversight does to people, culture, and history. Forever has an all-important question mark for several reasons. Theologically, and I'm grateful to Marilyn Rouse of the John Newton Project for this particular detail, the word forever, as many will know, is referenced 8 times in 1 Chronicles 17. The word also appears in the final line of the final verse of the Newton version of Amazing Grace. And for several people I interviewed, the comfort and pride they felt in the hymn was because they felt as though the hymn had been around forever. And that was a wonderful thing. But in context of Newton's slaving narrative, a question emerged during the process. Should we sing this song forever? Question mark. And that is why the question mark is there. Behind each song are at least 10 other possibilities for telling it. In the telling of Amazing Grace, the dominant story is so often the biographical. John Newton, slaver turned contributor to the abolitionist campaign. But forever, as in tonight's performance, is a people's take on the hymn, one which invites people to sing the story of themselves. These are sometimes more substantial, sometimes compressed, fleeting glimpses into other people's lives, testimonies, and perspectives. I began this quotation with a quote from Carol Ann Duffy, the first female laureate in 355 years of the formal existence of the role. But I am going to end with a quote from Professor Daphne A. Brooks about the laureate of soul, and that's Aretha Franklin. Brooks' sumptuous, glorious reflection is from her obituary homage to Franklin, a musician whose vocal authoring of Amazing Grace at the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles in 1972 led to the album being hailed as one of the greatest albums of all time. We'll go to the final slide. Okay, I'll just read you, just in case you can't see here. What she writes is, she, as in Aretha, taught us so much about the preciousness of our emotions, our inner worlds and desires. She dared to voice and make public the nuanced, emotionally heterogeneous interiority of Black womanhood, becoming a conduit for articulating the beauty and sensuousness the rage and the despair, the sadness as well as the joy of Black life, transduced through African-American female musicianship. She turned the vocal run itself into 1,000 miles of freedom. The intelligence of her millissima, a kind of singing in which notes upon notes are strung together into one syllable, lifted that musical gesture out of the Black church and planted it firmly in the mainstream, transforming the style of popular singing. I wanted to end there because I wanted to reflect just in a final sentence about this idea of poetry and music and them being public-facing in marking a moment in time. I believe that a laureate finds the language to express a moment. And in that sense, all creatives are laureates of what might otherwise be without them lost or missing experiences. That's what we do. It's something that might be lost or forgotten, stolen, undocumented, unimagined, overlooked, without that creative thinking and documenting it through their art. So I'll stop there and say thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Donald to speak briefly now. Donald is a world expert on the music of George Frederick Handel, who is perhaps a composer among the first names to come to mind when we think of music written for particular occasions, celebrations, ceremonial occasions. And of course, we've heard some of that earlier this year with the coronation. So in terms of thinking about music and commemoration, it seemed good to broaden out a little more, and Handel seemed a very appropriate place to go. So Donald.
Thank you. Really, this is stimulated by coronations, being a recent event. Zadok the Priest by Handel, the one piece that has been done in every coronation since, that is 7 times after Handel's lifetime. And therefore it's become part of, as it were, the fabric of what happens in the British service. A couple of things really as starters for this. How are we to understand Handel from this point of view? Because this is music for the big occasions. There are several things where Handel is much better than me, as a composer, for example, but also as a linguist. The remarkable thing, if you look at Handel's letters, you sometimes think, oh, you know, he's made out to be a sort of German. You just read the letters. He does French, he does Italian, he does English, he does, and he's obviously, and obviously German. There's a very characteristic style, personal style, but he's obviously very fluent in all of them. I'm very envious. And actually what happened in his curious path to London, coming from Halle, working in the Opera House in Hamburg, going to Italy. He was obviously fluent in Italy. There are 30 operas and in Italian. And then, but I mean, the reason that he came to London was the attraction of the Italian Opera House. But he came in 1710, and it's a very remarkable story because at that time he had a post at the court of Hanover, to which he had to return sometime. And what he writes in a letter in 1711, well, first of all, 1711, his first opera in London, is a great occasion. But he says, I'm just going back to Germany and I'm going to learn English. And he comes back the next year. And the way that politics have moved in the war was ending, the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. There were big celebration national services in St. Paul's Cathedral during Queen Anne's reign for the victories of the Duke of Marlborough. And there was a big one planned for the peace celebration. And Handel really had just come back in 1712, 1713. And for some reason, the way Handel had this way of getting round the people at the top, he was chosen as the composer for the music, the Te Deum and Jubilate, where there was a model in the one written by Henry Purcell. He'd worked out, this is an English text, it's from the prayer book, it's a fixed text, everyone knows what to do. I've seen what Purcell did, I'm now going to do it my way, which partly meant just bigger. And so you have this very grand setting in 1713. I say really only months really after Handel had got into contact with the English language. Very remarkable. He'd tried out an anthem with the Chapel Royal first, but he found his way into getting the right musical inflections, as it were, into an English text. He didn't really, I think, have any problem over the text in a sense, because, of course, from his family background, his father, a barber surgeon, his mother, the family were Lutheran pastors going back ages. He knew all about the Bible. And so, in fact, when a similar thing happened in 1727, when the king died, King George I, actually on his way on a visit to Hanover quite suddenly, everyone sort of ran around quickly and sort of how do we plan the coronation? And there was actually someone else in post as Master of the King's Music who probably ought to have done it. But George II, as he became, obviously chose Handel for the job. And he had actually made Handel composer for the Chapel Royal. He had a court post. And so Handel was selected for that. And of course, when we come to this question of music for the church, the coronation service, the liturgy, goes back 1,000 years before then. The various anthems would have been sung to plain song chant until the 17th century, where we start to get instrumental things, first of all, trombones and cornets, and then from Charles II's reign, the violin band, the orchestra, the start of what we would know now, and pieces for orchestra and choir. And that is where Handel had, as it were, come in with the Utrecht music. And therefore, when you look at Zadok the priest and the 4 coronation anthems, they're things that had been set by previous composers, though we mostly don't have the music. I say for 800 years they'd been sung to chant and not set. But he's now setting it for chorus and orchestra. And he's thinking out how this is going to happen. There's one story that says he was sent by the Archbishop the order of service for the coronation, and the man said, "This is what you must do." And Handel said, "I know my Bible. I've read my Bible. I will choose for myself." And actually, he did select the things, but not in the right order. You can't do much about Zadok's. It has to go with the anointing. It's at that moment in the service. It can't be anywhere else. And there had been, there's a 17th century setting for which only the singer's bass part survives, so we don't know quite what it was like. So really, Handel was the first one really to pick this up and go into this sort of grand style, what he could see happening, that big crescendo, starting with just with the orchestra, yes, there, and then going into the colossal choral entry. And then God Save the King. And this then becomes something else. If you have a look at the, if only I'd known, I would have brought pictures of the autograph. 20 pages, big stuff. They got every oboe player who knew which way up to hold the instrument. every trumpet player who knew which end to blow in London was more or less out for the job. And so this was big music. There's a little bit of chaos in the Abbey. They didn't have mobile phones or anything to keep everyone together. One person who was there wrote on their order of service, all chaos in the music. Not during Zadok, because it's very cunningly set up, where you've got the rhythm set up there with the strings before the choir comes in. And then God Save the King, actually it's a very subtle bit. God save the King, God save the King, God save the King, may the King live forever. When Handel wrote it first, it came around 4 times. God save the King, God save the King, God save the King, God save the King, may the King live. And Handel suddenly realised that if you get the overall pattern of the rhythm of the music, it'd be better without that bar. So actually, it's very sort of cunningly, well, this is what people who write music do, if you see what I mean, right? To see what the chances are to do with the words there. But then, just to finish up quickly, because I'm sure time is pressing, you're about to tell me, that I think that then what happens beyond the coronation service, apart from the fact it's done at every other coronation, it then is taken up in other ways. We would think that there's an obvious thing with the Jacobite period around 1745, with the start of the national anthem, as we have it now, God Save Great George our King. But actually, God Save the King is also sung, and we never quite know which piece is being done. But what had happened was that Zadok the priest had become established before that, because it was an anthem that was sung at charity festivals, Salisbury, Winchester, 3 choirs. It was a regular part of the programme. There was a church service, but there were also concerts. And it came to singing what was then simply called the coronation anthem, which was Handel's anthem, which was then done, first of all, in church services associated, and then in concerts. You then get it in the 1730s, before the Jacobite thing. It's actually established as a choral orchestra piece in concert programs before that happens. And therefore it comes out of the coronation and into concert life. And that really is the story of how it's taken up.
Thank you very much, Donald. I'll just close with a few reflections on a very different work of commemoration from those Donald has just been talking about. If it's not a work you know, I encourage you to find it and listen. It's called On the Transmigration of Souls by the American composer John Adams. And he was commissioned to write it for the first anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York and elsewhere in the US. And he felt, on the one hand, this was too soon, but the commission was there and he had to find a way to respond. And for me, doing some reading about this work made me think about some of the things that Rommi's talked about, the counterpoints of people's reactions to Amazing Grace. Many people want to celebrate a well-loved hymn that means a lot for them spiritually or in other ways. Others have difficulty with aspects of Newton's life and legacy, and we'll hear those counterpoints this evening. And in the Transmigration of Souls, Adams has to deal with lots of different things going on, the sense of the nation mourning, but a sense of individual lives too. The sense of what he says when words fail and what to do, and how music can step in where he said words fail. And he picks that out by the choir in that work struggling with the word remember at the start, and then naming. There's a backing that's pre-recorded of names of those who died in the terror attacks. So it's a striking work that is about the different ways in which people remember and the different things that people remember. And writing about it, Adams said, music has a singular capacity to unlock these controls on our emotions and bring us face to face with our raw, uncensored, and unattenuated feeling. Now, he's obviously dealing with something very specific. Here we're dealing with 250 years of people's responses to a hymn. But I think there's something in there about music's ability and poetic words' ability to communicate in ways that our ordinary language or ordinary conversation, sometimes we can't find the words, that expression that Adams picks up on. So I hope that's something that maybe we can dwell on, the ways in which these words, these contrapuntal words in music that we hear tonight, pick up fragments of different people's memories as we explore the music for the first time of Forever this evening. So thank you very much. We may, and I'm looking over there for guidance on this. I don't know whether we're just out of time for questions, Graham, or whether we've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes. If anybody has a succinctly formed question that they would like to ask that we may have a chance of answering, please do raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, on the front here.
I was interested about the historical narrative in some of Rommi's poems, because you've talked about 23 interviews, but actually you're using sources that are clearly relating to contemporary events of abuse of slaves on ships and the numbering of female slaves being transported. You also write a little bit about the experience of Sierra Leoneans. And I just wondered how you sort of tapped those historical sources when you were essentially speaking to 21st century people, and what was that process?
Thanks for the question. So actually the inventories that I refer to in one of the songs actually are historical documents, and they are Newton's own documents. They are the background reading that I did. So they're not contemporary documents in terms of numbers of the women, I think it is, that you're referring to, that occur in one of the songs. But I think the past and present are interlinked, and we are here because those people were there. Those people, certainly in the research that I interviews, one of the things that came up most powerfully in the voices in the interviews where people really protest. They felt a profound refusal of this hymn, and particularly around the word wretch. You talked about the difficulties in the peace transmigration of souls around the word remember. Well, wretch was a really difficult word for people who felt that they just were not going to take that on and not allow that to be a word to describe themselves, given Newton's history as a slaver. It felt ironically and painfully so. I'm saying this to answer your point about the contemporary, which is that there's an interplay between the two, and that, I hope, in some way comes across. I'm going to keep my response succinct because there might be another question that we can squeeze in.
Just thinking about the difficulties relating to Newton's biography, how relevant is the author's biography, though, to a work of art itself? Because I remember a songwriter saying that their interpretation of the meaning of their song does not take priority over the listener's interpretation and their meaning of it. So how much should we be responding to Amazing Grace as a work in itself, divorced from Newton's biography?
Well, in a nutshell, the piece tonight is part of what you've just said, which is it's a people's response, or various people's responses to the song itself. It isn't a biographical telling of Newton's story. The kind of a people's response, or some people's response that I interviewed, feels like it's the missing part of things. We're talking about audience, we're talking about impact, we're talking about the ways in which text lives in people so that it almost has another life to it. It becomes not the text that Newton wrote, indeed. It becomes the way that we live those words in our everyday lives, the ways that, the amount of times, even when people detested the hymn for various reasons and felt of it like Colston's statue, for instance, that it was on a plinth of automatic respect and should be taken down. They still knew the words. And of course, we know that that's what Obama reckoned on when he sang it at Clementa Pinckney's funeral. He knew that people would know the words. So there's that binary. That's the conflict. You might not like it, but you know the words. And why is that? And this piece is about, in some way, wanting to engage with the why of this means something to people. And it's not comprehensive. It can't be. We would be into kind of Mahabharat territory, and we'd be here till next week. You know, there are so many stories to tell, and tonight is just some of them. And I hope when you listen tonight, if I may say, I hope when you listen, you wonder where you are or how you might have responded to the questions that you hear. I wonder what your stories of connection and disconnection are. Because if anything, this piece, it honours the research process. And so I hope as an active audience sitting and listening, you think about how you would have responded to the questions being asked.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you. I think we need to wrap up there in terms of getting the performance space ready. So thank you very much for coming, and I really hope that you find the work stimulating and rewarding just a little bit later on. So thank you all very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge, because they're here in this room, and it would be remiss not to acknowledge that actually the community choir that have been formed especially for this project, a number of them are sat in this room. And I really want you to know that in no small part, this piece is their piece, because they represent the voices of the communities that have been interviewed. And they've given their time and their energy, along with their choir director, Craig McLeish, to this project. And I thank them, and thank you for coming to this talk.